They say if a house is offered far below its market value, there is always a reason. Sometimes it's termites, faulty wiring, or a leaky roof. But in one narrow street outside Mongkok, the reason was far darker and no one ever dared to speak it aloud. The real estate sign looked ordinary enough: for sale, urgent, cheap. Families came to look, charmed by its spacious rooms, its wooden staircase, and the way the evening light spilled through cracked windows. Yet every buyer left pale, refusing even the lowest price. When Daniel, a young office worker, signed the papers, the agent's smile was brittle, and the neighbors avoided his eyes. That night, he moved in alone, boxes stacked in the hallway, imagining the start of a new life. But houses remember. The walls held whispers that lingered long after the lights went out. Floors creaked beneath invisible weight. And sometimes, in the reflection of a darkened window, another set of eyes stared back, eyes that did not belong to him. They say the house is cheap because it doesn't want money. It wants something else. Daniel was not the type to believe in superstition. At 28, he worked long hours at a logistics company in Kowloon, his salary barely enough to cover rent for a cramped studio. When he stumbled upon the listing for the two-story house priced at less than half the market rate, he felt he had outsmarted the world. Finally, he would escape the endless cycle of rent and tiny apartments. The house stood on the edge of a narrow side street, half hidden behind an overgrown hedge. Its wooden shutters sagged, the paint peeling to pale flakes, but Daniel only saw potential: a fresh coat of paint, some renovations, and this place could be transformed into the dream he had chased for years. The neighbors, however, seemed less enthusiastic. An elderly woman selling vegetables across the street warned him in a low voice. People don't stay there, not for long. But Daniel laughed it off. Rumors, he thought. Old wives' tales to scare off buyers. On his first evening, he carried his boxes up the creaking staircase, each step groaning under his weight. The air smelled faintly of mildew and something else, something metallic like old iron. In the living room, dust covered the mantel, but the fireplace had ashes that seemed strangely fresh, as though someone had used it only yesterday. Daniel settled into the upstairs bedroom, its wide window facing the street. As night fell, he noticed the street lamps flickering, the glass panes trembling slightly in their frames. Still, he told himself it was nothing unusual. A cheap house, an old structure, of course there would be quirks. What he didn't realize was that the house had been waiting for him. The first night passed quietly enough, though Daniel slept uneasily, waking several times to the sound of floorboards settling. He dismissed it as the natural complaint of an old house adjusting to a new occupant. By morning, the unease had faded, replaced by excitement as he began unpacking. But then came the small disturbances, so subtle he nearly convinced himself they weren't real. It began with the doors. The back door to the kitchen, which he swore he had locked, stood wide open when he came down for breakfast. He blamed himself, maybe he had forgotten, distracted by fatigue. Yet that same evening, after securing every latch, he returned from the bathroom to find the front door ajar, swinging slightly on its hinges. The next was the radio, an old transistor he had found left behind on a shelf. When he tested it, the dial spun but produced only static. He had set it aside, but one night, just after midnight, the crackle of static drifted from the living room. Daniel went down, heart pounding, only to find the radio buzzing with a faint, broken tune, something that sounded like a lullaby sung through water. He pulled the batteries out, but the sound lingered for a few seconds after, and always there were the footsteps. At first, light creaks on the stairs, as though someone had climbed halfway up and stopped. Then, a deliberate pacing across the hallway outside his bedroom door. Each night, the steps grew bolder, lasting longer, until Daniel could no longer pretend it was just the house shifting. Still, he tried to explain it away. Houses breathe, he told himself. Old wiring can trigger radios. Drafts can open doors. The mind invents when it wants to be afraid, but the repetition gnawed at him, night after night. The same sequence. Doors opening, static crackling. Footsteps circling closer. By the end of the first week, he had begun sleeping with the bedroom light on, clutching the lighter he kept from his smoking days, as if a flame could protect him from what lurked in the corners. One morning, he found something new. In the dust of the mantelpiece where he had placed his keys, there was a pattern 5-finger marks drawn through the dust, perfectly straight, as if someone had dragged their hand across it during the night. The keys lay beside them, not where he remembered leaving them. The air in the house grew heavier, thick with a faint smell of burned wood, mixed with something sour, like spoiled fruit. The neighbors who once nodded politely now looked away when he passed. And at night, lying awake, Daniel sometimes thought he heard a voice beneath the footsteps, too faint to understand, but whispering as though from inside the walls. The house was no longer just old, it was listening. By the second week, Daniel's confidence had started to erode. The noises, the smells, the strange disturbances, they were no longer occasional, but nightly. And each time he tried to dismiss them, the house responded with something more undeniable. One night, as rain lashed against the windows, he heard the unmistakable sound of water dripping in the upstairs bathroom. He went to check, annoyed by the thought of a leak. But when he flicked on the light, the sink was bone dry. The dripping, however, continued. It came not from the pipes, but from the mirror. Beads of water slid down its glassy surface as if the mirror itself was sweating. And in those shifting drops, he thought he saw the outline of a face peering back at him, not his own. Another evening, while searching through a closet for storage space, Daniel discovered a shoebox tucked deep in the shadows. Inside were photographs, old and yellowing. Every picture showed the same house, his house, but different families. Couples, children, even an elderly man in a wheelchair. Each photo had been slashed with a blade, faces cut away so only the bodies remained. At the bottom of the box lay a newspaper clipping. Family found dead in apparent murder-suicide. House left vacant. The date was 15 years ago. Daniel's hands shook as he stuffed the box back into the closet. He told himself it was coincidence that every old house had its share of grim stories. But deep down, he knew the cheap price was no accident. The phenomena escalated. Objects moved when his back was turned. A chair dragged itself 3 feet across the floor. A glass rolled deliberately off the counter and shattered. One night he woke to the sound of whispering low, overlapping voices rising from beneath the floorboards. He pressed his ear to the wood and felt it vibrate as though dozens of mouths were speaking at once from inside the foundation. Sleep became impossible. Daniel's once neat appearance gave way to hollow eyes and trembling hands. He avoided going home until late, lingering at cafes and walking the streets just to delay the inevitable. But the house seemed to punish his absence. When he finally returned after staying away for a full day, he found his belongings rearranged. Clothes he had folded lay scattered, books stacked into strange shapes, and written in the dust of the stair rail was a single word: stay. The neighbor's silence grew heavier. Once, in desperation, Daniel confronted the vegetable seller across the street. "What happened in that house?" he demanded. The old woman's eyes darted nervously to the windows behind him before she whispered, "You should not be there. No one lasts long. They never leave whole." Then she turned away, refusing to say more. That night, Daniel dreamed, or thought he dreamed, of someone standing at the end of his bed. A woman, hair matted and black, skin stretched pale and thin. Her eyes 2 hollow pits leaking shadows. She didn't move, didn't speak. But when he jerked awake, heart pounding, the bed sheets were soaked with mud, as though something had climbed onto the mattress straight from the earth. By now, Daniel no longer laughed at the rumors. The house was alive, and it wanted him. Daniel tried to convince himself he could still leave, that if he just packed his things and walked out, the nightmare would end. But the house had no intention of letting him go. That night, as he sat in the living room with every light blazing, the temperature dropped so sharply he could see his own breath. The walls groaned, not like wood expanding or settling, but like something alive flexing its bones. Then came the voices, not whispers this time, but a chorus, rising from the floors, the walls, the ceiling. 1,000 overlapping cries that seemed to shake the very air. Daniel clamped his hands over his ears, but it made no difference. The voices were inside him, drilling into his skull. The radio on the shelf flicked on by itself, static exploding before tuning into that same warped lullaby he had heard days earlier. Only now, the words were clear. A woman's voice sang softly, tenderly, until her tone sharpened into a scream. The lights burst. One by one, every bulb shattered, plunging the house into darkness. And then he saw her. The woman from his dream stood in the doorway, her silhouette pale against the deeper black. Her head tilted unnaturally, hair dripping as if soaked in dirty water. When she stepped forward, the boards beneath her feet didn't creak, they cracked, splintering as though the wood recoiled from her touch. Daniel stumbled back, his phone trembling in his hand as he flicked the flashlight on. For a brief moment, the beam revealed her face, hollow sockets where eyes should be, a mouth torn wider than nature allowed, stretching in a grin so grotesque it made his stomach lurch. "Why did you buy my house?" she rasped, her voice wet and guttural, echoing as though spoken by many throats at once. He couldn't answer. His voice was gone, strangled by terror. The mirror from the basement was now standing in the corner of the room, though he hadn't carried it up. Its surface boiled with smoke, hands pressing against the inside like trapped insects clawing at glass. Daniel turned to run, but the front door slammed shut, locks snapping into place on their own. Windows rattled violently, but every pane was unbreakable, as if reinforced by something stronger than glass. The woman advanced, her shadow stretching unnaturally long across the floor until it touched his shoes. He felt the ground soften beneath him, the wood rippling like liquid. His legs sank an inch, then another. He thrashed, kicking free, but the floor swallowed more with each step. The mirror brightened. From its depths, shapes emerged, faces of the families, mouths gaping, eyes wild. They reached outward, and their cries became words. "Stay with us! Join us! You belong here now!" Daniel screamed. In a desperate act, he hurled the phone toward the mirror. The glass cracked, splintering in jagged lines. For a heartbeat, the voices fell silent, the woman flickering like a disrupted signal. Hope flared in his chest. But then the mirror healed itself, the cracks fusing back together with a shriek of grinding glass. The woman's grin widened, splitting her face like a wound. "You can't break what isn't yours," she hissed. The floor gave way entirely. Daniel crashed into the basement below, landing hard among the altar's debris. His ribs burned, his vision blurred. But above him, the woman leaned over the opening, peering down like a predator savoring its prey. The shrine candles reignited on their own, flames burning green and cold, the air filled with the stench of decay. From the mirror, now looming against the wall, arms began to spill out gray, skeletal, clawing for him. They brushed his skin, left streaks of frost across his arms. One hand clamped onto his wrist with crushing force. Another grabbed his ankle. He kicked, screamed, tore free, but more and more reached for him. The voices thundered now, chanting in unison. The name carved into the dust on the stairs days earlier burned itself into the wall above the altar. Daniel. He knew then there was no escape. The house wasn't just haunted. It was a trap, a living thing that lured its victims with promises of comfort and cheap price, then devoured them whole. Daniel clawed for the staircase, dragging himself upward as the hands tore at his clothes. He reached the doorframe, fingernails splintering on the wood. For an instant, he thought he could make it, but the woman was already there. She crouched in the doorway, blocking the exit, her face inches from his. Her breath was ice on his cheek. "Cheap," she whispered, "but not free." And with that, the house swallowed the lights, the voices, and Daniel's scream all at once. Sleep deprived and desperate, Daniel turned to the one place he hadn't yet explored, the basement. The entrance had been sealed with a heavy padlock, but one stormy evening, as lightning cracked across the sky, he found the lock already snapped open, hanging uselessly from the door. The air that rushed up from below was cold, damp, and heavy with rot. Carrying only his phone flashlight, Daniel descended the narrow stairs. The walls were lined with scratches, long gouges carved deep into the plaster. At the bottom, the basement opened into a low, sprawling space littered with broken furniture, burned candles, and something far worse. In the far corner stood a shrine, a crude altar built from stacked bricks, stained dark with something that looked too much like blood. On it rested dozens of personal items: children's shoes, a wedding ring, photographs torn into halves. The same families from the box upstairs. Their missing faces were here, placed as offerings. Daniel's light caught on the largest object, a framed mirror leaning against the wall. Its surface was clouded, but as he drew closer, he realized it was not dust, it was smoke, swirling within the glass as though trapped behind it. And then, faintly, faces began to emerge. Dozens of them, wide-eyed, mouths open in silent screams. He stumbled back, his shoulder knocking over a stack of newspapers. Scattered across the floor, headlines screamed: "Murder-suicide, claims family of 4, second tragedy in same house." Authorities unable to explain pattern. The dates spanned decades. Each time, the house was sold cheaply. Each time, the outcome was the same. It wasn't coincidence. The house had been feeding, claiming every new family that dared to live within its walls. And Daniel, in his greed for a bargain, had walked straight into his hunger. The realization hit him with icy clarity. The house wasn't haunted because of the deaths. The deaths happened because of the house. At that moment, the basement light flickered, and the mirror's smoke thickened. One face pressed forward, clearer than the rest, a woman's, her mouth opening as if to speak. The sound came a second later, a whisper that seeped into the room like poison. "You're next." Daniel dropped his phone. The screen shattered, plunging him into almost total darkness. Only the mirror glowed faintly, and in its depths, he could see not one, but many hands reaching outward, straining to cross the threshold of glass. He ran, scrambling up the stairs, the whispers following, growing louder with each step. By the time he slammed the basement door shut, his heart was pounding so hard he thought it might burst. He knew then, the house wasn't just alive, it was waiting for him to break, to surrender, to join the others. Every city hides its shadows, and every bargain carries a cost. Daniel thought he had beaten the system, that he had found a way to secure comfort without sacrifice. But comfort taken without price often demands payment in another form, one far greater than money. The house was never cursed by chance. It was designed to lure the desperate, the hopeful, the ones who believed they could outwit fate. Each tenant became another layer in its history, another voice in its walls, another warning ignored. There is a lesson buried here, as cold and heavy as the foundation stones themselves. Not everything cheap is a gift. Sometimes, the world offers you a key knowing full well that once you turn it, you can never leave. Perhaps the house still stands, its signs still bright, its windows still reflecting the neon glow of the city at night. And perhaps, if you walk past it, you'll feel a sudden chill, as though someone inside is watching, waiting. If you ever see a home offered for far less than it should be, ask yourself why. Ask yourself what price isn't being written on the contract. Because some homes don't want your money, they want you. The next morning, the house stood as it always had, quiet, still, and unremarkable. The for sale sign was once again posted out front, the paint fresh, the letters bold. To passing strangers, it was simply another property waiting for a new owner. But Daniel was gone. His belongings remained neatly arranged inside, as if he had never unpacked them. On the mantel, the keys sat where he had left them. His jacket hung by the door. Even his phone rested on the counter, screen black. There was no sign of struggle, no broken glass, no overturned furniture. Only the faint smell of smoke lingered in the air, and the cold echo of voices that could never be traced. The neighbors did not ask questions. They had seen this before. Another tenant vanished, another soul consumed. Some whispered that at night they could still hear a man's footsteps pacing inside, followed by a desperate pounding on the windows. But when they looked, the curtains never moved. The house was patient. It always had been. It would wait as long as necessary until another eager buyer came along, blinded by the promise of a bargain. And when they signed the contract, when they stepped through the door for the first time, they too would hear the faint laughter in the walls and understand too late why the house had been so cheap. Because the price was never money. The price was always life.